Maria had worked for many years as a maid in a big city, moving from one house to another, cleaning floors, washing clothes, and cooking food for families who barely noticed her. Her back often ached at night, and her hands were rough from soap and water, but she never complained. She had only one dream, and that dream was her daughter, Isabella. Everything Maria did, every coin she saved, every meal she skipped, was for the little girl who gave her life meaning. Isabella was different from the children Maria usually saw in the houses she cleaned. She was quiet, gentle, and carried herself with a kind of dignity that surprised even her teachers. Where most children demanded new toys or fancy clothes, Isabella would smile at her mother and say, "I'm happy with what I have." That humility made Maria love her even more. For years, Maria wanted to give her daughter something special, something that would show her that she was not less than anyone else's child. She watched rich families send their children on vacations, flying across oceans as if it was the easiest thing in the world. Maria knew such a thing was impossible for her, yet she never let go of the hope that one day her daughter might see the world outside their small neighborhood. That day came sooner than she expected. After years of hard work and careful saving, Maria finally had enough money to buy a ticket for Isabella. It was not for a luxury trip or a vacation. It was a scholarship opportunity that Isabella had earned through her own hard work at school. A program was sending her to another country to attend a youth camp, and all Maria had to do was cover the ticket. For many, it was a small expense, but for her, it was a mountain. Still, she climbed that mountain because nothing was too high when it came to Isabella. The morning of the flight was full of emotions. Maria woke up before sunrise to cook a simple breakfast. She wanted the day to feel special, though the food on the table was the same rice and beans they ate every day. Isabella noticed the sparkle in her mother's tired eyes and hugged her tightly. "Mama, don't worry. I'll be fine. It's just a flight." But Maria couldn't help worrying. It was not just a flight for her. It was the beginning of a new chapter, a proof that her daughter's life could be bigger than her own. At the airport, everything felt overwhelming for Maria. The loud announcements, the crowds of people rushing in different directions, the shiny floors that reflected the bright lights. It was a world far from the quiet houses she cleaned. But Isabella, though nervous, walked with steady steps. She was dressed simply, in a plain blouse and jeans, but she looked graceful, her small bag hanging from her shoulder. When it was time to say goodbye, Maria held her daughter's hands for a long moment. "Remember who you are," she whispered, her voice trembling. "You are strong, you are kind, and your father would be proud of you." Isabella smiled softly. She had heard stories about her late father, a man who had once served in the military as a pilot, though he had passed away when she was very young. She never truly knew him, but through her mother's words, she felt he was always watching over her. As Isabella boarded the plane, Maria's eyes filled with tears. She waved until she could no longer see her daughter. Her heart was heavy, but at the same time, it was filled with pride. She knew she had given Isabella something more valuable than money, an opportunity to rise above circumstances. Inside the plane, Isabella found her seat by the window. She looked out at the runway, the workers moving around with glowing sticks, the luggage trucks rolling by. The world outside seemed busy, but inside the cabin, everything felt calm. Passengers shuffled to their seats, some already pulling out books, others adjusting their seatbelts. Isabella leaned back, closing her eyes. The stress of the morning, the emotional goodbye, the excitement of the journey, all of it melted into a gentle drowsiness. As the engines roared to life, the vibration hummed through her body like a lullaby. Isabella's eyelids grew heavy, and before the plane even lifted off the ground, she drifted into sleep. She didn't notice the safety demonstration, didn't hear the flight attendants walking down the aisle, didn't feel the slight jolt as the plane lifted into the air. For her, it was as if the world had paused, letting her rest. Her dreams were soft and scattered. She saw her mother smiling, her father's face she imagined from old photos, the blue sky stretching endlessly. To her, the flight was not frightening, not unusual. It was simply a chance to rest in the middle of life's chaos. She had no idea that while she slept peacefully, Events were about to unfold that would make this flight unforgettable, not just for her, but for everyone on board. Around her, the other passengers barely noticed the young girl resting so quietly. Some thought she was just another student traveling abroad. Others didn't pay attention at all. But soon, every eye on that plane would be wide open, every ear straining to hear, every heart pounding as fear and uncertainty spread through the cabin. For now, though, Isabella slept. And in that calm before the storm, her innocence was like a gentle shield against the turbulence of the world, a reminder that even in moments of danger, there can still be peace. The plane glided smoothly through the sky at first, as if it had no intention of disturbing the passengers. People relaxed in their seats, some opening magazines, others putting on headphones, a few already snoring softly. The sound of the engines was steady, like a giant humming in the background, and the air inside the cabin was cool and calm. To anyone watching, it looked like an ordinary flight, nothing more, nothing less. Isabella, the maid's daughter, was still asleep by the window, her head resting against the side, her chest rising and falling with each quiet breath. She looked so peaceful that the middle-aged woman sitting next to her smiled, thinking of her own daughter back home. It was rare to see someone sleep so deeply on a flight, especially a young girl traveling alone. The captain's voice had come earlier, cheerful and professional, reminding everyone to sit back, relax, and enjoy the journey. It gave the passengers confidence, the kind of reassurance they expected whenever they flew. After all, the captain was the one in control, the person trusted with their lives, and his calm words made them believe everything would be fine. But not long after the plane leveled high above the clouds, a small shake rattled the cabin. At first, no one paid much attention. Turbulence was normal, they thought, just air pockets or weather changing outside. A few nervous travelers tightened their seatbelts, while others continued reading as if nothing had happened. Then it came again, stronger this time. The plane dipped suddenly, sending a wave of gasps across the cabin. Coffee spilled on one man's shirt, a child clutched her teddy bear, and the flight attendants exchanged quick, uneasy glances before forcing smiles back onto their faces. They had been trained to stay calm, but even they felt a strange shiver. "Ladies and gentlemen," the captain's voice returned, still steady but with a slight edge now. "We are experiencing some turbulence. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. There is no cause for concern." Passengers tried to obey, but whispers spread like wildfire. Some looked out the windows, hoping to see clear skies, but all they saw were thick, rolling clouds stretching endlessly. The seatbelt signs glowed red above their heads, blinking like warnings from the heavens. Isabella stirred slightly in her sleep, shifting her head but not waking. She seemed untouched by the fear that was slowly creeping through the cabin. Around her, conversations grew sharper. One man muttered, "This feels different." Another woman whispered, "Why is it shaking so much?" A teenager laughed nervously, trying to act brave, though his hands gripped the armrests tightly. The plane jolted again, more violently, and trays clattered. A few overhead bins rattled as though they might burst open. A flight attendant hurried down the aisle, making sure everyone was seated, but her smile no longer reached her eyes. She knew something was wrong, though she couldn't say it aloud. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. The turbulence did not pass quickly as it usually did. Instead, it grew unpredictable, sometimes shaking hard, sometimes calm for a moment, then suddenly tossing the cabin again like a small boat caught in a stormy sea. The passengers' nerves began to fray. A baby cried loudly, her mother bouncing her gently but with trembling hands. A businessman closed his laptop, staring straight ahead as sweat collected on his forehead. Some began to pray quietly, clutching rosaries or whispering under their breath. Then, for a brief moment, everything stilled. The plane flew smoothly as if nothing had ever been wrong. People exhaled in relief, leaning back into their seats, hoping the worst was over. But before anyone could relax fully, the cabin lights flickered once, then twice, before stabilizing again. That was when the first real wave of fear swept through the passengers. Why were the lights flickering? Why was the turbulence so strong, so uneven? Something felt unnatural, as if there was more happening than just bad weather. The captain's voice returned, but this time it was slower, heavier, as though he was choosing each word carefully. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "we are dealing with a technical issue, and our team is working to ensure your safety. Please remain calm, remain seated, and trust the crew." The words "technical issue" struck like a bell in the hearts of the passengers. Technical issue? That was not turbulence. That was something else. Panic began to rise. People exchanged wide-eyed looks, but no one dared speak loudly. Everyone wanted to believe the captain, yet deep down they sensed something larger was at play. Still, in the middle of this storm of emotions, Isabella slept soundly, her young face unbothered. Her soft breathing was almost strange in a cabin filled with fear. The woman beside her glanced at her again, shaking her head in disbelief. How could anyone sleep through this? The crew moved quickly but quietly, whispering among themselves near the galley, rushing in and out of the cockpit with tense expressions. Passengers noticed and their worry deepened. If the crew was worried, then something serious was happening. Outside, the sky was a swirl of dark clouds, flashes of distant lightning illuminating the horizon. The aircraft rocked slightly with each passing gust. For those peering through the windows, the sight was both breathtaking and terrifying, a reminder of how small and fragile they were in the vastness of the sky. Then, without warning, a sudden drop made everyone gasp loudly. Bags slid forward under the seats, a soda can rolled down the aisle, and a child screamed. The captain had not warned them about this one. Fear gripped every heart. It was in that very moment, as the plane steadied again, that something unusual occurred. The captain did not reassure them this time. Instead, there was a pause, silence filled only by the hum of the engines and the nervous breaths of hundreds of passengers. Then came his voice, trembling ever so slightly, carrying a weight of fear it had not carried before. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "if there is any fighter pilot on board, please make yourself known." The words hung in the air like thunder. Passengers froze, unsure if they had heard correctly. Fighter pilot? Why would a commercial flight need a fighter pilot? People turned to one another, their eyes wide, their mouths open but speechless. Questions raced in their minds faster than the plane itself. And while the cabin filled with a new kind of fear, Isabella remained asleep, her head still against the window, dreaming in peace, unaware that the world around her was about to change forever. The cabin was already heavy with tension, but when the captain's words echoed through the speakers, the air seemed to freeze. Passengers stopped breathing for a moment, their eyes darting around as if the answer to his strange question might be written on the walls. A fighter pilot? On a commercial plane? The thought made no sense, yet it was real because the captain himself had asked it. The voice that had earlier sounded calm and cheerful was now edged with something none of the passengers had expected to hear: fear. It wasn't just the words that struck them, it was the way he said them. There was a tremor in his tone, as though even he could hardly believe what he was asking. For a few seconds, the entire cabin was silent. The hum of the engines was the only sound, mixed with the faint creak of the overhead bins as the plane shifted slightly in the air. People looked at one another, mouths open, but no one spoke. Then the whispers began. "Did he say fighter pilot?" One man muttered, eyes wide. "That can't be right. Why would he need that?" Another passenger whispered back. Mothers held their children closer. Men clenched their fists nervously, and elderly passengers shook their heads in confusion. Some thought it was a joke, some feared it was a hijacking, and others believed something was wrong with the plane that only someone trained in military flying could fix. Near the front, a businessman pressed the call button for a flight attendant. When she appeared, he leaned forward. "What does he mean by fighter pilot? What's happening?" he demanded, his voice louder than he intended. The flight attendant gave the same tight smile she had been giving since the turbulence began. "Sir, please remain calm. The captain will update you shortly. Everything is under control." But her eyes betrayed her. She looked away too quickly, as if afraid she might reveal more than she should. The businessman leaned back, unsatisfied, and shook his head. Meanwhile, Isabella remained curled against the window, still asleep, as if nothing in the world could disturb her. The woman beside her, however, was far from calm. She was wringing her hands nervously, her lips moving in silent prayer. She looked at Isabella, envying the peace on the young girl's face, yet wondering if that peace would vanish the moment she woke up. The murmurs grew louder. Some passengers began asking aloud why the captain would call for a fighter pilot. A young man in the back laughed nervously and said, "Well, unless one of us is hiding in uniform, I think we're in trouble." His attempt at humor fell flat, and no one laughed. Then the captain's voice returned. "Ladies and gentlemen, please stay seated and remain calm. This is not a drill. If anyone on board has fighter pilot training, please identify yourself to the crew immediately." The confirmation made hearts pound even faster. This wasn't a slip of the tongue, not a mistake. He was serious. Something had gone wrong, terribly wrong. A mother hugged her little boy tightly, whispering into his ear to cover the sound of the announcement. A group of students traveling together exchanged terrified glances. An elderly man clutched his chest, breathing heavily as if the stress might overwhelm him. Every mind was filled with questions. Was another plane nearby? Was there a threat outside in the skies? Was the plane losing control and only someone who had flown combat aircraft could help? The unknown was worse than any explanation, and the unknown was all they had. The cabin crew moved quickly up and down the aisles, scanning faces as though hoping to find someone who might rise from their seat and say, "Yes, I'm a fighter pilot." But no one moved. Not a single hand was raised. The silence after the captain's request grew heavier and heavier, pressing down on everyone like a weight. One man stood slowly, his face pale. I'm a private pilot," he stammered. "I fly small planes. I'm not a fighter pilot." The nearest attendant gave him a sympathetic nod. "Thank you, sir. Please remain seated. We'll let the captain know." The man sat back down, his hands shaking. It was clear even he knew his experience was nowhere near enough. A teenage boy leaned toward his father. "Dad, what's going on? Why would they need that?" His father didn't answer, only gripped his son's shoulder, trying to appear calm though his face was pale. Through it all, Isabella's steady breathing continued. The woman beside her finally touched her arm gently, whispering, "Sweetheart, wake up." Isabella stirred slightly, blinking her eyes open, confused by the sea of worried faces around her. "What's happening?" she asked softly, her voice still thick with sleep. The woman shook her head, forcing a weak smile. "Nothing, dear. Just a little problem. Don't worry." But Isabella noticed the woman's trembling hands, the way her eyes darted nervously toward the front of the plane. She sat up straighter, looking around. Fear hung in the air like smoke, thick and choking. She felt it even before she fully understood why. Another jolt shook the plane, smaller than before, but enough to remind everyone that their situation was far from safe. Gasps erupted, and someone began to cry quietly. The lights flickered once again, dimming before coming back. The sound of the engines wavered for a moment, or maybe it was just the passengers' imaginations playing tricks on them, but the fear was real. The captain spoke once more, this time with urgency. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are doing everything we can. Please, if there is anyone on board with military flight training, make yourself known immediately. Your assistance could save lives." The words "save lives" spread through the cabin like fire. They weren't just passengers anymore. They were people in danger, lives hanging by a thread depending on a miracle. Some passengers buried their faces in their hands, others whispered prayers, and a few stared straight ahead, frozen in shock. No one could understand how a normal flight had turned into this. And in that tense, fearful silence, Isabella blinked again, fully awake now, her heart beating faster, not because she knew what was happening, but because something deep inside her told her the calm she had felt earlier was gone. Whatever was coming next would change everything. The silence after the captain's words did not last long. Slowly, whispers turned into frightened conversations, and the quiet hum of the plane became mixed with nervous voices. Everyone wanted answers, but there were none. People leaned toward strangers, asking if they had heard the same thing, repeating the captain's strange call for a fighter pilot. The more they repeated it, the stranger it sounded, and the more the fear grew. A young woman clutched her husband's arm, her eyes wide with panic. "Why would a passenger plane need a fighter pilot?" she asked, her voice breaking. Her husband tried to comfort her, patting her hand, but he had no answer. His lips were pressed tightly together, and the tension in his jaw showed he was just as worried. At the back of the plane, a group of teenagers exchanged nervous laughs, trying to cover up their fear. One of them said, "Maybe it's just a movie thing, maybe he's joking." But no one laughed. Their eyes betrayed them, they were scared. Flight attendants walked quickly down the aisles, their shoes clicking softly against the floor, their faces pale but determined to look calm. They checked seatbelts, reminded passengers to stay seated, and asked people to keep their voices down. But even as they spoke, their eyes flickered toward the cockpit door, betraying their own unease. Every passenger was reacting differently. Some prayed under their breath, their fingers moving over rosaries or folded hands pressed to their foreheads. Some sat frozen, staring straight ahead, unable to move, as if even a shift in their seat might disturb the fragile balance of the plane. Others whispered theories, engine failure, a hijacking, a system crash, but no one knew the truth. A man in the middle rows pulled out his phone, hoping for a signal, but the screen stayed blank. Another passenger shook his head and muttered, "We're too high up. Nothing works here." The helplessness only deepened the fear. Then the turbulence returned, sharp and sudden. The plane jolted downward, and gasps echoed through the cabin. Drinks spilled, a tray slid to the floor, and a baby wailed loudly, the sound piercing through the air. A mother tried to hush the child, rocking back and forth, but her own hands shook so much she could hardly hold the baby steady. A flight attendant rushed to help, offering tissues and calming words, but her own voice trembled. She forced a smile, yet her eyes darted nervously toward the cockpit door again. Passengers noticed, and their fear doubled. If even the crew was nervous, what hope was there? Isabella stirred again, this time opening her eyes fully. She blinked, confused by the noise around her. The woman beside her gave her a strained smile. "Don't worry, sweetheart," she whispered. "Everything's fine." But Isabella could see it wasn't fine. She looked around, noticing the tense faces, the hands gripping armrests, the wide eyes staring at nothing. The air felt heavy with fear, even though she didn't know the details yet. She rubbed her eyes, sitting up straighter, and asked softly, "Why is everyone scared?" The woman only shook her head, not wanting to frighten her further. Meanwhile, the whispers grew louder again. Some passengers argued. One man insisted the captain must have meant something else, maybe a different kind of pilot. Another snapped back, "No, you heard him. He said fighter pilot. Fighter pilot." His voice cracked and people shushed him, but it was too late. The words spread again, fueling the fear. In the front rows, an elderly couple held hands tightly, their knuckles white. The woman whispered, "If something happens, at least we're together." The man kissed her forehead, his own eyes wet with silent tears. The tension climbed higher with every minute. The turbulence made the lights flicker again, and passengers gasped as the cabin shook violently before calming once more. It was like the sky itself was warning them, teasing them with moments of peace only to snatch it away again. Then came the sound of footsteps from the cockpit. The door opened briefly, and a flight attendant slipped out, her face pale, her lips pressed tightly. She moved quickly down the aisle, whispering to another crew member before rushing back toward the front. Passengers tried to read her lips, tried to catch a clue, but all they saw was fear written across her face. Somewhere in the middle rows, a man suddenly stood up. "We need answers," he shouted. His voice carried over the whispers, silencing the cabin for a moment. "We have the right to know what's going on." A flight attendant hurried to him, raising her hands in a calming gesture. "Sir, please sit down," she said firmly. "The captain is doing everything he can. You must trust us." But the man refused to sit right away. He looked around, his eyes desperate. Trust you? He asked for a fighter pilot. What aren't you telling us? His words only added fuel to the fire. The passengers' hearts beat faster, their whispers turning into sharp, frightened questions. Finally, the man slumped back into his seat, defeated. But his words had already done the damage. Fear spread like wildfire, hotter and faster than before. And through it all, Isabella sat quietly, watching, her young face calm compared to the chaos around her. She remembered her mother's words at the airport. You are strong. You are kind. At the time, they felt like a farewell blessing, but now they echoed in her mind like a hidden key. She didn't know why, but something inside her told her she was meant to be awake now, meant to be here for a reason. The passengers, however, did not notice her yet. Their attention remained on their fear, on the captain's unanswered call, on the shaking of the plane and the uncertainty of the skies. Every second that passed without an answer made their hearts pound harder. The captain's voice had not returned, and the silence from the cockpit was worse than any turbulence. It was the kind of silence that made imaginations run wild, the kind that turned doubt into terror. The passengers waited, trapped between fear and hope, wondering what disaster was approaching them from the clouds. And in that fragile, trembling cabin, fear had taken its seat among them, whispering louder than any voice. Isabella sat up straighter now, no longer the quiet girl sleeping by the window. She could feel the energy of the cabin, the way fear had taken over every passenger. People were whispering, some were crying, others were staring at the cockpit door as if the answer to their survival might walk through it at any moment. The woman sitting next to her touched her arm again, trying to comfort her. It's just turbulence, dear, she whispered, but Isabella could see the lie in her eyes. She looked around, confusion mixing with curiosity. Why is everyone so afraid? She asked softly. The woman hesitated, then leaned closer. The captain. He asked if there was a fighter pilot on board. Isabella blinked in surprise, the words sinking slowly into her mind. Fighter pilot? On this plane? It was such a strange request that for a moment she didn't know how to react. But then, deep in her heart, a memory stirred. Her father. She thought of him suddenly, like a voice echoing through the years. Her father, the man she barely remembered but always admired. He had been a fighter pilot before he passed away when she was still a child. Maria, her mother, often spoke about him with pride, telling stories of his bravery in the air, his calm under pressure, and his passion for flying. Isabella closed her eyes for a moment and could almost hear her mother's voice from bedtime stories. Your father had nerves of steel. He could fly through storms that scared everyone else. He always said the sky was his second home. As a little girl, Isabella would listen wide-eyed, imagining her father soaring through clouds, strong and unshakable. But it wasn't only stories. Before he passed, her father had spent hours with her in flight simulators at a nearby training center. She had been so small she could barely reach the controls, but he would guide her hands, explaining what every button and lever meant. To her, it had felt like a game back then, sitting in a dark room surrounded by glowing screens, learning how to land planes, how to read the dials, how to handle sudden emergencies. She had never flown a real plane, of course, but those lessons had stayed hidden in her memory, waiting quietly, like seeds planted long ago. As the passenger's fear grew louder, Isabella whispered almost to herself, "My father was a fighter pilot." The woman beside her turned sharply, her eyes wide. "What did you say?" "My father," Isabella repeated, her voice steadier this time. "He was a fighter pilot. He used to teach me things, too." The woman gasped and grabbed her hand. "Tell the crew. You must tell them." Isabella shook her head quickly, her cheeks flushing. "No, I'm not a real pilot. I'm just his daughter. I only played in simulators with him. That doesn't mean I can help." But the woman would not let go of her hand. She squeezed it tightly, almost desperately. "Child, listen. You may know something others don't. Right now, that might be enough." Her voice trembled, but her eyes burned with urgency. A flight attendant walked past at that moment, and the woman stopped her, her words spilling out quickly. This girl, her father was a fighter pilot. She knows things. Maybe she can help. The attendant froze, glancing at Isabella with wide eyes. Hope and doubt flashed across her face at the same time. She crouched down beside the girl. "Is this true?" she asked softly. Isabella hesitated, then nodded slowly. "My father used to teach me. I learned from him, but I've never flown a real plane." The attendant looked at her for a long moment, then stood abruptly. "Come with me." The words struck Isabella like a bolt of lightning. Her heart pounded in her chest. She wasn't ready for this. She wasn't trained. She wasn't an adult. She wasn't supposed to carry such responsibility. But as she stood on shaky legs, she remembered her mother's words that morning at the airport. "Remember who you are. You are strong. You are kind. Your father would be proud of you." Each step down the aisle felt heavier than the last. Passengers turned their heads, whispering as they saw the young girl being led toward the cockpit. Some looked hopeful, others looked doubtful, but all of them watched. A few even reached out to touch her arm lightly, as if she carried their last hope with her. Inside, Isabella's thoughts raced. She remembered her father's calm voice in the simulator. "Never let fear control you, ISA. Planes listen to steady hands and calm minds. If you panic, the plane panics with you." She tried to breathe slowly, just like he had taught her, steadying the wild rhythm of her heart. When she reached the cockpit door, she paused, her small hands trembling. She could hear muffled voices inside, the tense commands of the pilots, the beeping of warning signals. The flight attendant placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "It's all right. Just tell them what you know." Isabella swallowed hard and nodded. The door opened, and she stepped inside. The air was filled with noise, alarms, blinking lights, the low rumble of the engines. The captain turned his head sharply, surprised to see a young girl standing there. The flight attendant quickly explained. Her father was a fighter pilot. She knows some things. She might help. For a moment, the captain just stared, his eyes filled with disbelief. But then another jolt shook the plane, and one of the warning lights turned red. He looked back at Isabella, and his voice was low but urgent. "If you know anything, now is the time to speak." Isabella's chest tightened, but she raised her chin slightly. She wasn't her father, but his lessons lived inside her. And now, for the first time, she felt they might matter more than ever. The cockpit felt like another world compared to the cabin. In the back, passengers were whispering and panicking, but here the air was filled with the sharp sounds of alarms, the flashing of red and orange lights on the control panels, and the tense voices of pilots who were trying to keep the plane steady. The captain's forehead was damp with sweat as his hands gripped the controls tightly. The co-pilot tapped buttons rapidly, his voice low as he read out numbers and warnings that seemed to grow more urgent with every passing second. Isabella stood just inside the doorway, small and unsure, her heart pounding so loudly she thought the pilots could hear it. She felt the weight of their eyes on her, the disbelief in their faces. She was just a young girl, not a trained pilot, not someone with authority. Yet here she was, standing where no passenger was ever meant to be, called forward in the middle of a crisis. The flight attendant who had brought her whispered quickly to the captain. Her father was a fighter pilot. He trained her. She knows things. She might be able to help. The captain turned his eyes toward Isabella again. For a moment, there was silence, only the alarm beeping. He wanted to doubt, wanted to say no, but desperation showed in his tired eyes. "Is that true?" he asked, his voice low, steady but strained. Isabella swallowed hard. He used to teach me. I practiced in simulators with him. I don't know everything, but I know some things." The co-pilot let out a sharp breath. "Captain, she's just a child." But the captain shook his head. "Sometimes children surprise us." He leaned closer toward Isabella, his eyes fierce but filled with something else. "Hope. Listen, we've lost some of our systems. Backup controls aren't responding. If you know anything that can help us read these signals, now's the time." Isabella's hands trembled at her sides. Her first instinct was to say no, to step back, to insist she couldn't do this. She wasn't her father. She wasn't a pilot. She was just Maria's daughter, a girl who lived a simple life, who cleaned and studied and dreamed quietly. But then she remembered her father's calm voice in the simulator, guiding her small hands over the controls. Don't let fear control you, ISA. Fear makes mistakes. Calm finds answers. She took a slow breath, just like he had taught her. Her heartbeat was still wild, but her voice came out steadier than she expected. What warning lights are showing? The captain blinked, surprised, but he pointed to a section on the panel. Hydraulic pressure is unstable. Autopilot is failing. We're fighting the controls manually. Isabella stepped closer, her eyes scanning the blinking lights. Her mind dug into memories, searching for the lessons her father had drilled into her during those long hours in the simulator. She pointed carefully. If the hydraulics are unstable, sometimes you need to redistribute manually. Did you try the secondary valve override? The co-pilot looked at her in shock. How does she even know about that? But the captain didn't waste time questioning. He pressed the sequence she suggested. For a tense second, nothing happened. Then the shaking lessened slightly, the yoke responding with more strength. The captain's eyes widened. It worked. Not fully, but it worked. He looked at Isabella again, no longer with disbelief but with urgency. What else did he teach you? Isabella's hands gripped the back of a seat as she steadied herself. He always said, in emergencies, don't fight the plane too hard. Guide it. The plane listens to steady hands. The captain nodded, repeating her words as if to himself. Steady hands. His grip on the controls softened slightly, and the plane's motion became less erratic. In the cabin, passengers noticed the difference too. The turbulence wasn't gone, but it wasn't tossing them as violently as before. Whispers grew again, this time mixed with cautious hope. No one knew exactly what was happening, only that the shaking had calmed a little. Back in the cockpit, Isabella continued, her voice quiet but clear. The pressure gauge, if it's still dropping, you might need to reroute to manual backup, but that will make the controls heavier. My father showed me once. You'll need more force, but the plane will listen. The co-pilot tested it, his hands pushing harder. His muscles strained, but the plane responded better, holding its line more firmly. He let out a long breath of relief. She's right. For the first time since Isabella entered, the captain gave her a small nod of respect. You're helping us. Don't doubt that. Isabella's heart still raced, but a small warmth grew inside her chest. She had always felt her father's absence like a shadow, but now, in this terrifying moment, it was as if he was standing beside her, guiding her once again. Another warning light flashed, and the captain muttered under his breath. Fuel imbalance. Isabella leaned closer. Then you need to stabilize the tanks. Use crossfeed before it drains one side faster than the other. The co-pilot's head whipped toward her again, his mouth open. Captain. She knows too much for a child. The captain didn't argue. She's not just any child. She's a pilot's daughter. His voice carried conviction now, the kind born from realizing that even the smallest light can shine in the darkest moment. Isabella's small frame stood steady in the cockpit, her fear slowly turning into focus. She wasn't pretending to be her father, but she was using the pieces of him that lived on in her memory, the lessons he had given her without knowing one day they might save lives. In the cabin, passengers waited, anxious, unaware of the extraordinary scene unfolding just beyond the closed cockpit door. They only knew the turbulence had eased, and whispers of hope began to spread. Some prayed harder, some clutched hands tighter, but a fragile calm began to replace the raw panic. And in that cockpit, the captain and his crew leaned on the guidance of a young girl who had once thought her father's lessons were only games. Now, those lessons were the bridge between fear and survival. Isabella realized something powerful, that sometimes fate waits quietly, and when it calls, it does not matter how old you are, it only matters that you answer. The cockpit was no longer a place of hopeless panic. It was still filled with flashing lights, sharp beeping sounds, and tension so thick it could choke the air. But now something had changed. A girl who was never meant to be there, a maid's daughter who had grown up far from the world of aviation, was standing among trained pilots, offering words that made sense, suggestions that worked, and courage that surprised even herself. The captain's hands were steady now, his grip firm but calm as he guided the heavy aircraft through the unstable skies. Every time the plane jolted, he remembered her words, "Don't fight the plane too hard, guide it." Planes listen to steady hands. Those words, borrowed from her father and spoken through her trembling lips, were keeping him focused. The co-pilot, who had doubted her at first, now followed her instructions with determination. He adjusted the systems as she suggested, watching in awe as each small change improved the situation. The hydraulics were still weak, the fuel imbalance still threatened them, and the storm outside was still dangerous, but there was now direction, there was now hope. Isabella stood close, gripping the back of a chair to keep herself steady. Her heart beat so fast it felt like it would leap from her chest, but her face showed calm she didn't fully feel. Inside, she was terrified. She knew she was no real pilot, just a girl repeating lessons from long ago. But every time doubt crept in, she heard her father's voice in her memory, patient and reassuring. "Emergencies don't ask who you are, ISA. They only ask if you're brave enough to face them." Another alarm rang, this one shrill and urgent. The co-pilot cursed under his breath, reading the screen. "Altitude drop, Captain. We're losing height too fast." The captain pulled hard at the yoke, his arms straining. The plane resisted like a wild horse. For a few terrifying seconds, the nose dipped, and the passengers in the cabin screamed as their bodies pressed against the seatbelts. Drinks spilled, luggage shifted, and the sound of fear filled the air once again. "Think, Isabella," she told herself silently, forcing her mind back into the simulator lessons. Her father had shown her something once, when the system failed during a training run. She gasped as the memory came rushing back. "Trim control," she blurted out. "Use the manual trim, reduce the load on the elevator. It'll make it easier to pull up." The co-pilot looked at her like she was speaking magic, but the captain moved without hesitation. His hands flew to the controls, switching to manual trim. The pressure on the yoke lightened almost instantly, and the plane responded, slowly but steadily climbing back to a safer altitude. Relief swept through the cockpit like a gust of fresh air. The captain let out a breath he didn't realize he was holding. "Good call," he said, glancing at Isabella with eyes that now carried respect, even admiration. In the cabin, the screaming quieted as the descent stopped. Passengers clutched their seats, their hearts still racing, but they could feel the change. The plane was climbing again. Some sobbed with relief, others prayed louder, thanking God for a chance to live. Isabella felt her knees weaken. She wasn't sure how much longer she could keep standing, but she refused to give up. She had started this, and she would stay until the very end. Minutes dragged like hours as they battled the failing systems. Each problem felt like a new enemy, and each time Isabella reached into her mind, digging up her father's lessons. Some were small details, resetting switches, balancing gauges, steadying controls. Others were simple reminders that kept the pilots focused. Breathe, stay calm, guide the plane instead of fighting it. She was not in the simulator anymore. She was in the sky, in a real aircraft filled with real people whose lives depended on every decision made inside this cockpit. The weight of that truth pressed down on her shoulders, but somehow it didn't crush her. Instead, it lifted her higher, reminding her that this was more than just her father's legacy. It was her moment of courage. Outside, the storm raged, lightning flashing across the clouds, thunder rumbling like a giant's roar. But inside, the girl's quiet voice cut through the chaos. "Steady. Keep it steady." The co-pilot shook his head in disbelief. "Captain, I can't believe this. She's holding this together." The captain didn't answer. He only gave Isabella a brief nod, his lips pressed into a thin line. Words weren't necessary. They all knew what was happening. In the cabin, passengers still had no idea who was helping the pilots. They only knew the plane was more stable now. Some noticed the young girl had not returned to her seat, whispering among themselves, but none of them could imagine just how much she was doing in the cockpit. At one point, the plane tilted dangerously to the side, and alarms screamed again. Isabella gripped the chair tighter, her knuckles white. She remembered her father's laughter during one of their practice sessions, when she had overreacted to a sudden problem. Balance is everything, ISA. Planes are like people, they need balance to stay alive. Her eyes shot to the panel. Check the aileron balance. One side's pulling harder than the other, she shouted. The captain adjusted quickly, and the plane straightened, the tilt easing back into level flight. The co-pilot stared at her again. How do you know this? Isabella's eyes filled with tears, but her voice stayed strong. Because my father taught me. He taught me everything he could. And I listened. The captain gave her another look, softer this time. Then he would be proud. You're saving lives tonight. Those words sank into her heart like fire. For the first time, she believed it. She wasn't just repeating lessons anymore. She was living them, applying them, using them to hold hundreds of lives in the balance. She wasn't only Maria's daughter, the maid's child who grew up in shadows of other people's wealth. Tonight, she was something greater. Her father's daughter, a fighter's daughter, someone carrying strength far beyond her years. The alarms had not stopped, and the danger had not disappeared, but courage had taken root where fear once lived. And in that cockpit, courage did not wear a uniform or hold a license. It wore the face of a young girl who refused to let fear silence her, who stood tall when the world expected her to crumble. As the plane pressed onward through the storm, guided by the hands of trained pilots and the memory of a fighter pilot passed down to his child, Isabella realized she was no longer just helping. She was becoming part of the fight, proving that courage often comes from the most unexpected places. The night had been long, the storm had been merciless, and the alarms in the cockpit had screamed like warnings from another world. But finally, through the steady hands of the captain, the sharp focus of the co-pilot, and the unexpected courage of a young girl, the plane began its descent. The passengers had no idea who was guiding them towards safety, only that the terrible shaking had calmed and the violent drops had lessened. Hope, fragile but real, returned to the cabin like the first light after darkness. The captain's voice came over the speakers, calmer now though still strained. Ladies and gentlemen, we are preparing for an emergency landing. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. We ask for your silence and cooperation as we bring this plane safely down. The words sent chills through the passengers, but they also brought relief. Emergency landing meant survival. Emergency landing meant there was still a chance. People clasped hands tighter, prayed louder, whispered to loved ones sitting beside them. Some closed their eyes and imagined the moment the wheels would touch the ground, begging for that sound to come soon. In the cockpit, Isabella stood close behind the pilots, her legs aching, her throat dry, but her eyes alert. She had guided them through warning after warning, remembering every detail her father had taught her years ago. She was tired, but she refused to rest until the plane was safely down. She whispered softly, almost to herself, "Steady. Just stay steady." The captain heard her and nodded, repeating, "Steady." Outside, the runway lights came into view, glowing like stars on the ground, promising safety. The storm clouds still rumbled above, but the sight of the earth below filled everyone with new strength. The descent was tense. Every second felt like an hour. The plane tilted, then corrected. The engines roared as the pilots adjusted speed. Alarms still blinked, but the guidance was clear now. Isabella pointed out the final adjustments she remembered, reminding the captain to ease pressure on one side, to balance the controls carefully before touchdown. He followed her words without hesitation, his trust in her complete. The cabin grew silent as the ground came closer. Passengers held their breath, gripping their seats. A baby whimpered softly, but even that sound seemed quiet against the heavy anticipation. All eyes were fixed forward, waiting for the moment they had been dreaming of since fear first struck. The landing. Then it happened. The wheels touched the runway with a jolt, the sound loud but beautiful, the kind of sound that made every heart leap in relief. The plane shook, the brakes roared, and the smell of heated rubber filled the air. For a terrifying second, it felt as though the aircraft might skid, but then the tires gripped the ground, and the long, heavy body of the plane slowed. Faster at first, then slower still, until finally silence. The engines eased, the alarm stopped, and the plane rolled to a complete stop. For a moment no one moved. The silence was so deep it felt sacred. Then, like a wave crashing over a shore, the cabin erupted into applause, cheers, and sobs. People hugged each other. Some cried uncontrollably. Others laughed in disbelief. They had survived. Against all odds, they had lived to see another day. The captain's voice returned, this time steady and warm. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have landed safely. Please remain seated until further instructions. Thank you for your courage and cooperation." His voice broke slightly at the end, as if even he was overwhelmed by the miracle that had just unfolded. In the cockpit, the captain turned to Isabella. His face, once pale with fear, now carried a smile of gratitude. "You saved us," he said softly. "Don't ever doubt that. Tonight, you were braver than most people twice your age." The co-pilot, still catching his breath, nodded in agreement. "You have your father's spirit," he said. Isabella's eyes filled with tears. She had held herself together the whole time, but now that the danger was over, the emotions poured out. She covered her face with her hands for a moment, trembling, not from fear anymore but from relief. She thought of her mother, of how Maria was probably at home worrying, waiting, praying. She wished her father could see her now, wished he could know that the lessons he left behind had carried her through this storm. When the passengers were finally allowed to leave, many of them noticed the young girl stepping out of the cockpit with the captain by her side. Whispers spread quickly. "That girl? She helped. Is it true? She was the one?" The truth came out in small pieces, shared by the crew and confirmed by the captain. The maid's daughter, the quiet girl who had slept through the early panic, had stepped into the cockpit and guided the plane when it mattered most. Gasps of amazement and disbelief filled the air. Passengers reached out to touch her hand, to thank her, to call her a hero. Some even wept as they embraced her, their voices choked with gratitude. Isabella was shy, lowering her head, not used to such attention. She never thought of herself as a hero. She only thought of her father and the lessons he had given her, and of her mother who had sacrificed everything to give her a chance in life. She whispered softly, almost to herself, "Papa, I hope you're proud." When she finally saw Maria again, her mother's arms wrapped around her so tightly it felt like she would never let go. Maria's tears flowed freely as she listened to the story, each detail filling her with pride and awe. Her daughter, the daughter of a maid, had saved an entire plane of people. She pressed her forehead against Isabella's and whispered, "You are stronger than I ever knew. Your father's spirit lives in you." That night became a memory etched into the hearts of every soul on that plane. For the passengers, it was a story of survival, of fear turned into relief. For the crew, it was a reminder that help can come from the most unexpected places. And for Isabella, it was the moment she discovered her own strength, the moment she stepped out of her father's shadow and carried his legacy forward. The world would remember her as the maid's daughter who slept peacefully until the captain's fearful call awakened something extraordinary inside her. And she would remember it not as a miracle of luck, but as proof that courage often hides in the quietest hearts, waiting for the moment it is needed most.